Alternatively, charming, spoiled, badly educated, simple-minded and demanding, and that previous girlfriend said he lacked class, was unromantic, unserious, short-tempered, imperious. What on earth did Meghan see in that then?
She saw someone who's needy. She saw somebody
she could fix.
Who she could use and who could serve her purposes.
Meghan, before she gets married, meets a very, very famous, important member of the British establishment. And that person is brought in every 3 to 4 weeks to Kensington Palace to tell Meghan about what her duties will be and how her life will follow her marriage to Harry, a part of the royal family. And that person very quickly discovered that Meghan was not going to obey any rules. She had no intention of staying, and that she was going to be a huge problem. And they realized that this was a marriage which was not going to last in Britain. She undoubtedly manipulated him and used and exploited his weaknesses. I think that she, in her wedding alone, when she had those all the Hollywood people there she didn't know, was plotting her return.
The thing about Meghan and Harry is that they started even before the wedding. I mean, the damage started before the wedding. She was dissatisfied, and of course it's gone on. And she's completely obsessed by herself. She's so unbelievably immune to anyone else's feelings. And that is, of course, why, in my view, she invents issues like she did about this whole conversation about Archie, the colour of Archie's skin. Everything is done to focus back on her. Everything is about her. The generosity is only about, if I express philanthropic views, how to reflect on me. And I think that's fine for her, except that she's doing it at the expense of our royal family.
They want all the perks, the titles and the baubles and the power, but don't want to actually come back to Britain and rule the work. They wanted to just milk the system from Montecito.
I mean, this was a calculated attempt against the family. And this is the other thing, which is one of the many, many lies she tells, that she arrived in London full career, single girl, wasn't interested. Of course, she'd been coming to London since 2013, hunting for a man to marry. She wanted an Englishman. She was on a manhunt.
And she also wanted a famous.
And she wanted a famous. And she arrived in London immediately when she went to Wimbledon, talked to the woman she was working for, and said, "You know Harry, can you arrange a blind date?" And the woman did. The whole thing is a tissue of life.
This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a strategy dressed in white silk. And according to Tom Bower, every single moment of that globally televised wedding may have been calculated long before the first guest even sat down. Because while the world watched Meghan Markle walk toward Prince Harry like it was the greatest love story ever told, there were whispers, quiet at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore, that this wasn't love unfolding, it was a plan executing in real time. And once you start connecting the dots, it stops looking like romance and starts looking like precision. Let's go back to the beginning, the part they wanted you to believe. Meghan, the outsider, the unaware American, the woman who had no idea who Harry was. Just a casual introduction, a blind date, a spark. Simple, innocent, except that version collapses instantly the moment Bower opens his notes. Because according to his findings, this wasn't accidental curiosity, it was targeted interest. Years before Harry even entered the picture, Meghan had already been circling London, positioning herself, meeting the right people, stepping carefully into elite circles. This wasn't stumbling into royalty, this was approaching it.
What I discovered was, of course, that she was hunting for a man in England from 2013 onwards, when her marriage had crashed and she couldn't find anyone in Canada at the time. And she wanted wealth and she wanted fame. And she targeted, there's no doubt she targeted Harry and found someone who was a childhood friend of his who could introduce them. And then on the days before they met at their blind meeting in a club in London, she researched Harry very carefully.
And when Harry finally appeared, the research didn't begin, it accelerated. Every interest, every emotional vulnerability, every passion mapped. Africa, charity, identity, trauma. It wasn't just attraction, it was alignment, strategic alignment. Because if you know exactly what someone needs to hear, you don't chase them, you pull them in. And according to the narrative laid out in the file, that pull worked instantly. One date, one impression. And suddenly, Harry wasn't just interested, he was convinced she was the one. But here's where things get uncomfortable. Because while Harry was falling in love, something else was happening quietly in the background. The clearing of the board. because Harry didn't enter this relationship alone. He had history, friendships, people who had known him long before titles became headlines. The kind of friends who don't just celebrate you, they question things, they notice changes, and those are exactly the kind of people who slowly started disappearing. It didn't happen overnight. That's what makes it so subtle. A comment here, a disagreement there, a social clash that felt small until it wasn't. At Sandringham, during what should have been a relaxed gathering, tension surfaced. Conversations turned into corrections. Jokes turned into confrontations. And suddenly, people who had been part of Harry's life for decades were being quietly repositioned further and further away. Not formally removed, just distanced, until invitations started changing. People who were once expected to stand beside him at the most important moment of his life weren't even in the room anymore. And in their place, a different kind of guest list was forming. But before we get to that, the real chaos hadn't even begun yet. Because while the palace was trying to maintain control of the narrative, Meghan's own family detonated it from the outside. The father, the staged photos, the headlines that spiraled out of control just days before the wedding. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. The kind of chaos that threatens the image of perfection the monarchy depends on. And here's the part that shifts everything. King Charles III, not as a king, but as a senior royal trying to contain a disaster, offered a solution. A simple one. Go to your father. Fix it. Quietly. Privately. Before it explodes further. It was an olive branch, extended at exactly the right moment. And it was refused. Not delayed, not reconsidered, rejected. And in that moment, something changed inside the palace. Because this wasn't just about family anymore, it was about control, about narrative, about what story would be told and who would be allowed to shape it. And if you look closely, that pattern keeps repeating. Because just as one family was being kept at a distance, another narrative was being pushed forward at full speed. The comparisons. The most dangerous comparison you could possibly make in that institution. Princess Diana. It didn't build slowly. It wasn't earned over time. It appeared almost instantly, woven into visuals, into messaging, into symbolism, the veil, the gestures, the emotional framing. And for those watching closely inside the palace, it wasn't flattering. It was alarming because Diana wasn't just a figure, she was a legacy, a woman who had spent years building public trust through action, not image. And suddenly, that legacy was being mirrored by someone who hadn't even begun the role. To some, it felt like homage. To others, it felt like appropriation. And at the center of it all was Harry, emotionally tied to that legacy in a way no one else could be, which made the comparison not just powerful, but deeply personal. And maybe that's what made it work, because when emotion overrides logic, perception becomes reality. And perception was everything. Which brings us to something even more revealing, the obsession with image. Because while the public saw a bride preparing for the biggest day of her life, behind the scenes, something else was being managed meticulously. The brand, the interviews, the magazine covers, the messaging. Every word, every frame, every headline had to align perfectly with a very specific version of Meghan Markle, not just as a bride, but as a global figure. When Vanity Fair placed her on the cover with the headline centered on Harry, it wasn't celebrated, it was questioned, redirected, because the focus wasn't where it needed to be. It wasn't about the relationship, it was about the positioning. And that distinction matters more than anything. Because once you start seeing the wedding not just as a ceremony, but as a platform, everything begins to shift. The guest list starts to look different. The timing starts to feel intentional. And the presence of certain names starts raising very specific questions. Because when people like Oprah Winfrey appear at your wedding, despite barely knowing you, it doesn't just feel social. It feels strategic. And that's where the narrative takes its sharpest turn. Because suddenly, the wedding doesn't just look like a union, it looks like a launch. Because once you see it as a launch, you can't unsee what came next. That guest list, it wasn't random. It wasn't just a blend of two worlds coming together in harmony. It was curated, carefully, precisely, almost like every seat in that chapel had a purpose beyond celebration. Names that barely had any personal connection to Meghan, suddenly front and center at the most exclusive wedding on the planet. Cameras catching every smile, every handshake, every interaction, and among them, figures like Oprah Winfrey, a woman who would later sit across from Meghan and Harry in one of the most explosive interviews in royal history. Now think about that for a second. At the time of the wedding, that interview didn't exist. The deals didn't exist. The public fallout hadn't happened yet. And still, the connections were already being placed. That's not coincidence. That's positioning. Because while the palace believed they were orchestrating a royal ceremony steeped in centuries of tradition, another kind of event was was quietly unfolding beneath it. One that had nothing to do with monarchy and everything to do with influence, visibility, and future leverage. And if that wasn't enough, the signals kept getting louder, because inside the palace, things weren't running smoothly, not even close. Staff weren't just stressed, they were overwhelmed. Instructions kept changing. Protocols were questioned. Traditions that had stood for generations were suddenly being challenged, adjusted, overridden. It wasn't collaboration, it was collision. And at the center of that tension was a simple but powerful mindset: control. Because this wasn't about fitting into an institution, it was about reshaping it. But here's the problem: the monarchy doesn't bend easily. It runs on hierarchy, on order, on knowing exactly where you stand and why. And when that order is disrupted, friction is inevitable. Which brings us to one of the most talked about moments behind palace doors: the clash with Catherine, Princess of Wales. Two women, two completely different approaches. One who had spent years learning the system, adapting to it, understanding its rhythm, and another who had just entered it but wasn't interested in following its rules. At first, it was subtle, differences in opinion, small disagreements. But as the wedding approached, those differences intensified until they exploded over something that should have been simple: a dress fitting. Not a major decision, not a constitutional issue, just a bridesmaid dress, a hemline, a detail. And yet, it became a breaking point, because when Catherine raised a concern, something practical, something fixable, it wasn't met with compromise. It was shut down completely, in front of staff, in front of designers, in a room full of witnesses. And according to Bauer's account, that moment didn't just create tension, it created tears. The future Queen of England reduced to tears over a disagreement that should have taken minutes to resolve. Now pause and really think about that, because this wasn't about fabric, it was about authority, about who gets to decide, about whose voice carries weight in a system built on rank. And Meghan in that moment made it clear she wasn't interested in falling in line. It was her way or no way. And that mindset didn't stay contained to one room. It spread. Staff started avoiding direct interactions. Conversations became calculated. People who had spent years serving the royal family suddenly found themselves navigating a completely different environment, one that felt unpredictable, demanding, and, according to multiple accounts, emotionally exhausting. Some didn't stay. They left. Because when working inside the palace becomes more difficult than leaving it, something has clearly shifted. But even with all that chaos behind the scenes, the world outside saw none of it. What they saw was perfection. The carriage, the dress, the smiles, the kiss, a flawless image. And maybe that's the most revealing part of all. Because if everything was so perfect on the surface, why was everything so unstable underneath? Why were relationships already fracturing before the vows were even spoken? Why were tensions escalating before the marriage had even begun? And most importantly, why did it all start unraveling so quickly after? Because here's where the narrative reaches its most uncomfortable conclusion. According to Bauer, the wedding didn't fall apart because of external pressure, not because of the press, not because of public scrutiny, not because of the monarchy failing to support them. It fell apart because expectations didn't match reality. Because the role Meghan entered wasn't the one she envisioned. She wasn't number one. She wasn't the central figure. She wasn't the crown. And in an institution where hierarchy defines everything, that realization changes everything. Because once you understand that, the next moves start making sense. The distance from the palace, the shift toward Hollywood, the deals, the interviews, the narratives being reshaped, retold, reframed. It wasn't a sudden decision, it was a pivot that may have been building long before the wedding day even arrived. Which brings us back to the moment everyone remembers, that walk down the aisle. Because while the world saw a bride stepping into a new life, there's a growing argument that what they were actually witnessing was something else entirely. An exit already in motion, a story that wasn't beginning but transitioning. And if that's true, if even part of that is true, then the most watched royal wedding in modern history wasn't just a celebration. It was a turning point, a perfectly staged moment where two worlds collided and quietly began pulling apart at the exact same time. Because in the end, maybe the biggest illusion wasn't the fairy tale. Maybe it was the timing. Because by the time the vows were spoken, the future had already been decided.